First item on the business agenda is the update of the American Rescue Plan Act. And I'm going to turn it over to Eric Christensen and Rebecca Hodge.
Thank you, Mayor and Council members. I am Eric Christensen, the city's finance director. The purpose of this agenda item is for management partners to present information about the American Rescue Plan Act and city's potential investment plan. By way of background, a contract was awarded to management partners last fall to provide planning and administrative support related to ARPA. They will be assisting the city to develop a plan for the use of federal stimulus funds that the city will receive through the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund established under ARPA in 2021. At this point, I'll hand off the presentation to Carol Jacobs, Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of Management Partners. Carol?
Good evening, Mayor and City Council. As Eric said, I'm Carol Jacobs and I'm with Management Partners, and our team tonight will be walking you through the American Rescue Plan Act, or as we like to say, ARPA. First of all, I do want to thank Eric and Rebecca for all of their help in getting us to this point. They've done a lot of work in the background, and it's been very, very helpful. Next slide, please. Just to give you a little bit of background about us, this is our first project in Burien, and we hope to come back and assist you for many more. We've been in business for 27 years. Our job is to make your life easier. That's what we do. We've done over 1,800 projects in 44 states. And next up, please. Thank you. So here's the agenda. It's not as big as it looks, but we're going to go over what ARPA is, what its uses are, how it's regulated, what the reporting requirements are. We'll give you some ideas of what we're seeing as best practices and guiding principles to use these funds, your response to the pandemic, some initial ideas about where you can spend this money, and the framework to invest in Burien, and next steps. Next, please. Overview. So we're going to do an overview of the American Rescue Plan Act right now. Next, please. So ARPA was established on March 11th, 2021, and it provided $1.9 trillion through two funding sources, one for states and one for local agencies. The purpose of the local funding is to support government for responses to the pandemic, including businesses and residents. Next slide, please. And here's how that breaks down for the local piece of the pie. The rest of the local fiscal is for $130 billion. And out of that, there were 5 categories in which you could use that funding: public health, emergency response, response to, I'm sorry, I can't see my entire slide. Let me get with you here in a second. There we go. Premium pay for workers, services. You can replenish your revenue that you lost because of the pandemic, and infrastructure, but infrastructure is very specific, and my colleague Steve Toller is going to go through that in a little more detail with you in a few minutes. Burien's total funding is $10.8 million. One of the nice things about this from when we started to now is that the final regulations from the feds have come in and have given us a little bit more guidance about what we can do. So I'll go to the next slide, please. And this is where the rest of that $1 trillion goes. It goes to direct federal assistance. People got checks, stimulus checks. They got $600, $800, $1,200. That's part of ARPA. SNAP and WIC funding. A bunch of money went to education and childcare, health services, transportation, disaster relief, emergency food, and then a bunch of money went to the state, counties, and local agencies. Next slide, please. Outside of what was given to cities and counties, additional funding went to emergency rental assistance, education, and transportation and infrastructure. So the cities are getting a big chunk of this pie, but also so are the other service providers that help our residents and communities grow and thrive. And there are two more agencies that, two more areas that are getting some funding. If you'll go to the next slide. So then there was some assistance for our low income and water energy assistance. So if people couldn't pay their water bills or their electricity or utilities bills, there was money provided for that, separate and apart from the funding that you're getting as a city. And then I'm not sure whether or not you all took advantage of this, but there was a lot of family leave credits. If somebody got sick or COVID or had a family member and had to be out, there was emergency sick leave that you could get reimbursed for if your employees were out. And that's another big chunk of change there. With that, I like to keep it short and sweet. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague and good friend, Steve Toller, to give you the nitty gritty of this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Carol. Good evening, Madam Mayor and council members. And I promise I'll try to keep it short and sweet as well, but I've got some of the details to get into with respect to how the city of Berea might be able to leverage these funds as an investment in the community. So if we can go to the next slide, let me cover some of the details about what Carol had provided to you on that one slide that showed the 5 different areas of use. Some people call it 4. The first 2 boxes that you see here, the legislation really called it one area, and it was responding to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And there were 2 elements to that. The first was responding to the public health emergency, and the other was responding to the economic impacts from the pandemic. And so, some examples of how these funds might be able to be invested in a local city in that first area are to help cover costs associated with COVID-19 mitigation and prevention, things that you may have had to do within City Hall or your city facilities to keep them more clean and sterile. You can use some of the funds for that, and medical expenses that were incurred by the city, as well as those in the community as well. So there are options there. The second area is to address the economic impacts, and a couple of things I want to mention here. There's been a lot of talk about how cities are starting to find ways to be able to assist those in the community that were negatively impacted by this pandemic. And we'll talk about those a little bit later. But the impacts on households and businesses, providing grants to small businesses, nonprofit organizations, aid to impacted industries, given that you're right next to SeaTac, there are hotels and other hospitality industry folks that were implemented by this, as well as really restaurants, right, within the area. There's another element of this funding that could be used here to help local governments rehire back to pre-pandemic levels. So the positions that you had to either freeze or to lay off during the pandemic, you could not only use these monies to help restore those, but you could use them to expand services to the tune of about 7.5% above your pre-pandemic levels. So those are the first 2 areas. They did provide some opportunities to be able to provide premium pay to those workers that may have been or considered essential workers, and the final rule expanded that list of what may be an option there. If we can go to the next slide, I want to talk about 2 areas that a lot of local governments are looking at using these monies for as an investment within their city and their community. One is, when the pandemic happened, your restaurants closed, businesses closed, sales tax revenues dipped. Didn't dip as much as what was expected, but it did dip. Any revenues that you would have been able to get through hotel taxes or other things, if you had those, we're all impacted. And so the legislation allows for a certain amount of money to be used to the extent of revenue loss. There's a lot of details about the revenue loss. I'm going to just mention it briefly in a little bit, but the final rule came out with a standard allowance of $10 million that could be used, kind of like when you're filing your taxes, how you can do the standard deduction rather than an itemized deduction on your taxes. They've now stipulated that they'll do a minimum, it's assumed that a minimum $10 million was lost by every local agency. And if you lost more than that, you have to do the math. Otherwise, you can just stipulate to $10 million. But you can, in this category, you cannot use these funds in three specific areas. You cannot use them to pay off debt. You cannot use them for judgment or settlement agreements, and you cannot use them to replenish financial reserves. And some cities have been talking about using these monies, well, replenishing the revenues that we lost. Wouldn't that replenish reserves? They want to see this money going into effect. But what you can do is you can use them for basically any government service that you provide. So there's a lot of latitude in this category for being able to use the ARPA monies to address the revenue loss. The final area that a lot of cities are looking at is this area of investment in infrastructure, especially those cities that are providing water and wastewater services. But as a note to that, even though you may not provide both of those services in one way, shape, or form, stormwater is considered in that area of wastewater. And so all of your efforts that you're doing in SWIM and stormwater and surface water management, there are a lot of opportunities to be able to use these funds for capital projects associated with that area. And also finally is the area of broadband. If there are underserved, or if there are areas of lack of reliable service, there are opportunities to use some of this money here. So I want to spend some time on those two slides because that really helps you understand, well, this $10.8 million that we got, what is it that we can really use this money for? And this is helpful to understand that. So now I'm going to go into a little bit of details on some of the other aspects of the legislation. So if we go to the next slide, there's a couple of areas that you cannot use these monies for, and they were very specific about that. Remember that what Congress was trying to do is put this money in play to help local agencies and really to help stimulate the economy. And so you don't do that by paying off past debts. And there was also a political reality to this of that they did not want to use these monies to be able to reduce taxes that had already been raised. And so you cannot use these monies for pensions or to do any reduction in taxes, both of which might not be very applicable to Burien. So if we go to the next slide, this guy takes us into a different area about, well, what is the regulatory authority and the administrative requirements of ARPA, because they can be fairly extensive depending on what level of use and how you use these funds and the reporting requirements that Congress wanted to see that these monies were well spent. So we'll put it, so if we go to the next slide, what this kind of gives you is a graphic in terms of what the authority is. The act was enacted by Congress, signed by the president in March of 2021. The Treasury Department is responsible for putting together the regulations for the governing the use of these funds. And then ultimately they created regulations in terms of a final rule. They had to start with an interim final rule because they wanted to get feedback on it. And they ultimately issued a final rule. I think it was January 6th of this month. So we have been frantically working with staff and other agencies across the United States that we're serving and helping to understand what those final rule requirements are. They've also provided some frequently asked questions on a lot of reporting guidance. They created a portal for reporting. I went through a little bit of time with Eric and Becca a little earlier today to go through that so that they understand what some of the reporting requirements are going to be for this. I won't bore you with a lot of the details of that, but suffice it to say that we're on top of it and we understand what those reporting requirements are. But in a couple of areas, I'm going to mention those because they're going to be important for you to understand the impacts that it has on staff. So if we go to the next slide, the timeline is that you have to use these funds by 2024, or if they're not used by the end of 2024, they need to be obligated, committed through a contract of some sort to have those expended, and they must be expended by the end of 2026. Well, the start date on this was March 3rd of 2021. That's basically the date that Congress passed the legislation before it went to the president's desk for signature. So from March 3rd, 2021 through end of 24, 26 is when these monies have to be expended. If we go to the next slide, there are several administrative requirements with this. And the first one that I want to capture is on this left side here of this graphic. And let me just summarize it by saying this. These monies are federal funds. And unlike the CARES Act money that you had received back in 2020, under the previous administration and the approvals that were done with the CARES Act, these funds are considered funds that are directly coming to you from the federal government, and as such, they are subject to what's called the Single Audit Act, which basically says that you have to go through a lot of hoops and have your you have to have the expenditures that you've used these monies for audited by your independent auditors. In this case, it's the state auditor that does that for you. Having worked in the audit profession in my previous life, the requirements are fairly extensive in terms of documentation that you need and the things that you have to adhere to, internal controls, et cetera. Eric and your city has hired us to capitalize our experience in that area and being able to help you and make sure that you're going to be able to have a clean set of books so that you will be able to be, hopefully pass that single audit and be able to retain all the monies that have been given to you. There are various reporting requirements. There was an interim report that was already filed by the city by August 31st of last year. The next report is due next week, and we're working with staff to get that report completed. But ultimately, it's going to be up to council to make the decision to how to best invest these funds in the city of Burien. And so while there's a report that's due, ultimately the demonstration of those expenditures will be in compliance with how the council has decided to use those funds, which you've already taken an action on that previous council in 2021 in terms of the mid-biennial budget adjustments that were made and the expenditures that were assumed there. There's various expenditure categories these funds have to be used in. And so we're tracking those and working with staff to make sure that they fit within the 7 categories that have been identified by the Treasury Department. So there's a lot of administrative issues that have to be addressed, and we're thankful for the opportunity to support you in those administrative and reporting requirements. So let's go to the next slide, and that takes us then to this area of what are best practices that we're seeing other agencies using across the country. Our firm right now is engaged actively with, I think we're at 15 or 17 agencies right now. I'm personally involved in 7 of those, and we're assisting these agencies in understanding what the opportunities are for the use of these funds. So if we go to the next slide, we just wanted to be able to share with you what we're seeing in some best practices. And the first area is just, use them strategically, address the revenue impacts that you have experienced, backfill those allowable costs as necessary, but also remember that these are one-time revenues. And the concept, the good guiding budget principle of one-time resources for one-time expenditures is something that I can't stress long and hard enough. We're seeing some cities that are talking about starting new programs, and to the extent that they find ongoing revenue sources to be able to address those, or funding sources, that's great. But in some cases, some agencies are getting into trouble by starting new programs that they're going to ultimately have to fund with their own services. And so I just caution you about that as you look at different options in terms of how to invest these funds within the community. And there's some, creative, options that you might have, from either investing into some deferred maintenance areas that might reduce your ongoing maintenance cost for your agency, to, using them as economic development seed money in your community to be able to expand your sales tax base. So there's some great opportunities that you have to potentially use these funds. And remember that you don't have to expend these funds until 2024. So while the clock is ticking, you do have some time to put together a good plan. Next slide. Also to remind you, as Carol had indicated earlier, this was $1.9 trillion. And remember, the bucket of funds that cities got was $65 billion. $1.9 trillion additional money was out there and available. And so if there are opportunities to leverage some of those other funds and to find some of those other funds and opportunities to be able to introduce your households and your businesses to sources to obtain those other funds, it's a great use of city resources and city time to be able to make sure that your community is able to tap into these funds to carry us and ultimately recover from this pandemic. Next slide. Then I wanted to address briefly in the legislation, the legislation wanted to make sure that those that were disproportionately impacted from this pandemic were taken care of. And those were defined in the legislation and by the Treasury regulations as low-income households and communities, households that are in what's called qualified census tracts, which are, some of you may be familiar with that concept, that are kind of zip code based, and they're based on whether the households in that area have a median income that is less than certain thresholds. So those have been identified in terms of the disproportionately impacted. But then in the final ruling, the Treasury added these other three banners that you see on the left-hand side. Any household that qualifies for certain federal benefits like TANF monies or SNAP or WIC funds, those are considered disproportionately impacted. Any households that receive from tribal governments, maybe not applicable in Burien, and for other U.S. territories, were considered. And the importance of these concepts of disproportionately impacted is that it makes it easier for the local government to make decisions in terms of being able to provide funds to those that were disproportionately impacted. And you see here on the two boxes, the columns on the right-hand side here, is low-income households, ones that were considered at that first threshold of impact, and then the second threshold is disproportionately impacted, and there's different reporting requirements for those two. But basically, if a household either made below 65% or 40% of area median income, then they were considered to be disproportionately or impacted by the pandemic. So that's a few words on that concept and the importance that will have in terms of program design if the city were to make a decision to move forward with using some of these funds as relief for those that were impacted by the pandemic. If we're going to go to the next slide, then I want to spend just a brief minute on the concept of qualified census tracts. We were able to work with your staff in identifying those census tract areas. We also got the information from the various federal sources that we were able to get it from, and put together this map that demonstrates those areas. So in the yellow, as you were well aware, is your city limits. Any area that is shaded in a pink hue is considered a qualified census tract area, and all of those households in that area are considered disproportionately impacted. And so that's something to consider again as part of program design for any direct assistance that might be given to households. Next slide. So let's talk about what some potential uses are based on some initial discussions and review of the city that we've taken to give you kind of, not to whet your appetite, but to kind of give you some ideas about how these funds might be able to be invested within the community. So if we go to the next slide, your response to date is that you've already had received, $2.3 million of CARES Act funds, and the city made choices last year or the year prior to invest those funds in these different categories, from economic support to ensuring that you were able to comply with different requirements, public health expenses, etc. And so we know that you have already taken some action in supporting the community and supporting the eviction moratorium, which I understand is also an item on your agenda perhaps this evening. I'm partnering with the Highline School District for free internet access. Great demonstration of how you've used these funds in the past. could be opportunities for you to leverage these new ARPA funds in those similar type of vein. So if we go to the next slide, the council, as I mentioned in the mid-buy adoption, had already allocated roughly about $1.7 million. And in the first 2 years, and for the fiscal year that just ended, 2021, there was $484,000 that was allocated, and an additional about just shy of 1.3 million in 2022. That leaves over $9 million that's still unallocated by you to ultimately make decisions. Now, some of these items in the area of some of the police costs and the human services costs could have potentially ongoing cost impacts, but you do have the option to, to look and say, how do you want to expend these monies, for the long term, for the investment in the community. And so there's still $9 million to ultimately be appropriated in your future budget cycles and as part of this process. So if we can go to the next slide. Some different options that we see is, the options of responding to that public health emergency is that first area of, PPE that your staff needs to be able to provide services, any COVID-19 testing that you might be requiring for your employees or helping them with vaccination and other things like that, are opportunities to be able to expend some of these funds, as well as capital investments or physical plant changes that you might need to be able to bring your employees back to the workforce, back into City Hall and other of your facilities, and improving your HVAC systems or providing the social distancing or the protections that you need to be able to serve the community. The economic impacts, of either providing business assistance, opportunities for you able to provide assistance to those that were disproportionately impacted. Also support to nonprofit organizations. Some agencies are looking at doing that. This area of revenue loss, again, I can't mention this enough, that you do have the opportunity to say, you know what, we are going to be using these funds to the extent of revenue loss, of which they've already provided you the standard deduction, as I said, of $10 million. With those funds, you would then demonstrate that you expended those funds for providing services in the community, services that you may already have budgeted. I want to be very clear about something, is that there is no requirement in the legislation that these monies must be used that that don't supplant other services. In other words, you don't have to add an additional $10 million in costs. You can use these funds and expend them for things that you already had budgeted to be used for. And then that gives you then the latitude to be able to use these funds, these now excess monies that you didn't expect to necessarily have, to fund those services. You can now turn around and say, okay, now that we've got that, we can use these funds in other areas. But from a reporting requirement, you would be able to report to the feds the use of those funds as government services, and it's a very simple way to be able to use those funds. And then finally, of course, the area of infrastructure investments, and I've listed some options that you might have here to be able to invest within the community. If we can go to the next slide, then as I wrap up my section, I'm going to turn over to Ashley in terms of how we are expecting to do some engagement within the community. It's really important to develop a plan, and this slide really represents what we see are best practices used by other agencies, where you engage the community in terms of how the pandemic has impacted them, and identify ways to be able to inform your decision about how to leverage these funds within your community. And we've talked about the determining the revenue loss piece. The facilitating decision making is something that is really important in terms as you make the decisions, and then you prepare that plan so that staff can implement it on your behalf. And then of course there's the nitty gritty that Eric and Becca have to deal with, and staff is tracking and reporting the expenditure of these funds so that you don't have to give a dime back to the federal government. implement. So let me wrap up. Let's go to the next slide. I just want to spend one final word on this revenue loss area. It is the area of least restrictive category of expenditures, and the reporting on this is extremely simple for the city to be able to do that for. There's some other things that we've mentioned here, and I've already kind of beat this one a little bit, but I want to just help you understand that there's an opportunity perhaps for the city to make the decision to use it to the extent of revenue loss, but at the same time say, you know what, we have these additional funds now. What is the best way for us to invest these funds within our community? So I'm going to wrap up now. Let me go to the next slide. And I've already talked about that. We'll go one more slide. And I've provided this information in your packet in terms of some guiding principles, and we already talked about a lot of those. So let me turn it over now to Ashley, and Ashley's going to give you some quick ideas about how we might be able to help you engage the community to inform your decision on the best use of these funds, and then we'll turn it back over to Carol and back to you for questions. Ashley.
Yes, great. Thank you, Steve. Good evening, Mayor and members of the City Council. I'm going to walk through a little bit about our decision-making framework and in particular, the community engagement aspect. Next slide, please. So Steve talked about the guiding principles, and this next piece in the green area is to talk about a community engagement plan before we return with a proposed resolution or ordinance for the council to adopt, and then ultimately an investment implementation action plan. Next slide, please. So here is the decision-making framework that Steve alluded to earlier. Next slide. So we're going to zero in on our facilitation of engagement. We definitely want to capture feedback from your diverse constituents and community-based organizations in Burien, and we'll give a little bit of details on how we plan to do that. We look forward to engaging your community with up to 3 focus groups and 2 community workshops, as well as deploy business and community surveys to learn more directly from Burien residents about pandemic impacts and listen to their feedback on how they would like to see the ARPA monies invested. Next slide. So our objectives are to facilitate conversation and receive meaningful feedback to share with the City Council and help you make the best decisions for the Burien community with these ARPA funds. Next slide. We will collaborate with your city's communications team to get the word out through existing communication channels as well as direct outreach. Next slide. We'll deploy surveys for community members and businesses to hear input from a wide range of stakeholders. Next slide. And finally, community workshops are an opportunity for a cross-section of the community to participate in this important process with the intent to reach diverse and disproportionately impacted groups. We anticipate facilitation will be conducted via Zoom for 2 community workshops to be scheduled likely in the early March timeframe. And I will turn it over to Carol now to wrap up our presentation.
Thank you, Ashley. Next slide, please. Nope, slide before that, sorry. So we have really completed steps 1 and 2 here. We have talked with your staff. They've come up with some ideas, and we'll be presenting those to you in a later date. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to schedule interviews with the council to get your feedback. It's very important that we understand where you're coming from and where you believe the community needs are. And then we will also do those community meetings that Ashley spoke about. And finally, we will develop and come back with, once we gather all that information, we'll do an analysis of that, and we will develop an investment plan for your consideration and approval. And then you can begin to implement that. And the next slide would be, if you have questions, here's all of our contact information. Eric and Rebecca can absolutely get a hold of us whenever they need. And we thank you for your time and attention.